Good afternoon. Let me pull this up. Good afternoon, and Mr. Chairman and Vice Chairman Deb Miller. I appreciate you being here, and Commissioner Begeman especially. I've been impressed with the ability that you guys have taken and the interest you've taken in these matters. What I want to do, Fargo is kind of interesting. I'm never usually in Fargo except in January for the North Dakota Grain Dealers Association, and I found out there's grass where I thought there weren't any. It's a lovely town. But it is a different place in the middle of the winter, and I want to start today. Let me kind of give you a brief background on. My name is Terry Whiteside. I'm from Billings, Montana. I serve as chairman of the Alliance for Rail Competition and represent and appear here on behalf of ARC and many of the wheat and barley commissions in the United States, including Montana Wheat and Barley and South Dakota, Colorado, Oklahoma, Washington, Oregon, Idaho Barley, Idaho Wheat, Wyoming, Nebraska, Texas, Montana Farmers Union, etc. But I also want to talk about the pea and lentil business and a little bit about the turkey farmers' issues, as well as general agriculture. It's interesting as we go forward in looking at what we're doing. I want to thank you for having this in Fargo, especially. Fargo is kind of ground zero for a lot of things. But your office of, in Lucy's office, the staff that came out to North Dakota and Montana and South Dakota and Minnesota did a marvelous job out here in gathering up information, and I compliment them on their abilities, and just they were able to help us kind of understand where you guys were going. Additionally, allowing the railroad industry folks here to hear from the railroad customers. Wheat, barley, pulse growers, growers of grain, including corn and soybeans, have for over a year been adversely impacted by recent railroad service problems, particularly on the BN and CP. But the service irregularities have culminated in one of the worst service meltdowns in modern history that I've been around, and what concerns the farmers the most is the lack of straight answers from the railroads. Yes, they've been reaching out. Yes, they've been making speeches. Yes, they've been working with their shippers, but the facts keep changing. When agricultural interests participated in the STB Annual Grain Car Council a year ago at the Tegma meeting, the picture, according to them, was characterized by a few issues, but they, the railroads, would be through them shortly. Well, in fact, they thought they would be done by December. And then came January, and then it was going to be March. Then came April, and then it was going to be June. Then it was going to be the end of the harvest in 2014. Then at the end of 2014, and last week, I heard Matt Rose talk in a speech to coal shippers that looked to the end of 2015 or early 2016. We need a department of straight answers at the railroads. I commend this board for requiring the filing of important information. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't even be getting the answers we're getting right now. Excuse me, but the concern I hear from growers of grain is their ability to provide timely and efficient service on the upcoming harvest and heavy shipping periods. And what I'm going to do today is just kind of expand a little bit. We've talked about North Dakota, and I don't want to leave out Montana and Washington and Minnesota and South Dakota and all of the problems. But if we can go to chart one. Chart one up there, that probably needs a little focus. Chart one is your reporting requirements of the Burlington Northern from that you issued on June 20th. And it's very commendable that the back order numbers have fallen, but it's the red line that bothers me. What we've done is we've taken Minnesota, Montana, North and South Dakota, combined them, compare them against the full numbers of back orders, and they run in right now they're running about 85% of all of the back orders are in those 4 states. 85%, been as high as 90. Now, and yet that comprises about 18.9% of the whole system, geographically. But 90% or 85% of all the back orders are sitting in these states. It's great to have them coming down, but it's not the whole story. It's still this part of the country that's getting hammered. There's a massive concentration in Minnesota, Montana, North and South Dakota, back-ordered cars. And I won't go through those numbers again, but my second concern is chart number 2. In chart number 2, all we're doing here is we're starting to chart the average speeds for the system and the average speed for the grain. They're still falling. Now, I have a theory. Until they turn those numbers around, the average speed numbers, we're not going to get out of this. It's like a freeway with a bunch of cars on it. It's all packed up. The answer is not putting more cars on, but getting the speeds up, getting them to start to run. So when we start looking at these numbers, we start to get very concerned. Table 1, which is the next one, simply shows you the concentration. BN, UP, and CP comprise over 80% of the cars carried and over 80% of all the revenue in grains. And this is in wheat. But the key is that until we get those speeds moving, we're not going to be able to get through this. I'm going to try to go real quick to try to catch us up a little bit. But chart 3 simply was an interesting number we took off the STB sites, and it simply starts to show that if we take corn, wheat, and soybeans versus oil and sand, and we find out and measure carloads, what we find out is that the BNSF in the 4th quarter of 2003 are now moving more oil than corn and soybean and wheat together. Last week, when I was at that coal conference, one of the things that was stated by the Burlington Northern was that we now have more train sets in oil than we do in all of grain. Now, if we go to the next chart, we simply show that wheat alone, instead of all of the other commodities, was bypassed in the 3rd quarter of 2012. Now, for us to sit there and say, well, it's the polar vortex and it's all the other things, the real reality is it might have been a combination of, but what started it last summer, contrary to popular opinion, winter doesn't come to North Dakota in September. And what was going on was they were out of power. This is growing so quickly. Now, is that a solution? No, but what I want to show you something that we've never seen before. Out in Montana, let me talk a little bit about wheat and how it's winter wheat extends all the way up the prairies into South Dakota, and they have it in Montana in the central and western part of the state. Spring wheat is mostly in North Dakota and in the northeast corners of Montana. Now, what's interesting is winter wheat is cut in Texas as early as June. It goes all the way up, and it finally gets into Montana in mid to late August. We are just completing the winter wheat cutting. Spring wheat hasn't really started yet. It hasn't started really in earnest here. But what's important is look at what's happened with winter wheat. Photo 1. Photo 1, we don't put grain on the ground like they do in Kansas and in Nebraska. They don't ever put wheat on the ground in Montana. Reason, because we have about 1.5 years worth of on-farm storage in the state. This is in Moccasin, Montana, and you'll see by the map that's right near Lewistown, right near and I know the chairman was out there in that part of the country. That's a very large pile. of wheat sitting at Moccasin. It's right in center state. We go to page or photograph 2, and you'll see that's at Hardin. This is an interesting pile. This is owned by a farmer. Now, it's a rather large farmer, but he hasn't gotten all of his 2013 crop to move out of storage, so he's putting the 14 crop on the ground. Now, this is winter wheat. If we go to photo number 3, this is interesting. There's 2 shuttle facilities up at Chester, Montana. Chester is right at the center of the High Line at the north end of the triangle. Chester, this is the EGT facility. They're awaiting rail cars. They just got rid of their 2013 pile in June of 2013. The other facility at Chester, just down the road, is the Columbia Grain Facility. Again, huge piles, and they're awaiting rail cars. Let me go on to photo 5. And by the way, we didn't get to all of them. We just got to as many as we could. As you know, it's a long way around in Montana. This is Conrad, Montana. Conrad is up on the western part of the triangle, just south of Shelby, Montana, where the High Line comes across. Wheat on the ground. The barley's in the elevator. You can't put barley on the ground. Again, these are huge, gigantic piles. And then finally, 2 more. This one is in Fromberg, which is just northeast of Billings. That's a fairly large pile. It's sitting on the ground. Farm storage is still full. Again, that's a farmer-produced one. And then Moore, Montana. Moore is just south of Moccasin, right around the Lewistown area again. This one was planned for storage. You can start to see by looking at that photograph that they actually had those, and they started to build them. We have never seen piles of grain on the ground in Montana in winter wheat like this, ever. Now, is that because everything's working well? No, it's because things aren't working well. So the strains on the BN capacity have resulted in added costs for grain shippers. This panel is going to talk a lot about that, so I don't want to kind of go over what they're going to go over. We sat down and talked a little bit last night, most of the participants, and the basis values due to poor service has cost the grain producers millions. Vice Chairman Miller was talking and was asking this morning about what would improve basis. What will improve basis is reliability of transportation. You'll get the basis back just with consistency of transportation. And that's what's distorting the basis everywhere. The estimated North Dakota had a state study out here, first 4 months of this year, $67 million for North Dakota farmers, and that was spring wheat and corn and soybeans, but it did not include durum, barley, sunflowers, canola, peas, lentils, beans, flax oil, etc. Here's my concern. When the BN says that we're going to readjust the fleet so that 51% are in shuttle service, and that's 3% of the elevators, handling 70% of the volume, our less than shuttle facilities are very important in the West. Reason, they provide all of the markets for the rotational crops. All the other crops basically go through those smaller or less than shuttle facilities. And I know you know that, we've been through this, but I think it's important to understand. Those are the ones I'm hearing 120-day reports behind right now, and those are the ones that provide all of our rotational crops. Remember that, for example, Montana is the #1 pea producer. You've got numbers of crops in North Dakota they're the top of the list. When I talk to Washington State, the Washington Grain Commission, they tell me that they're trucking further than they ever have. They can truck to the river, but they're not. The service is so bad on the railroads that what they're doing is they're actually trucking well up into north of Spokane, down into the river. BN participates in the primary market. They don't participate in the secondary market. They've made hundreds of millions of dollars in that primary market, and that doesn't go into the IRCS costing system. So it's not considered revenue. According to USDA, the primary market has been at historic highs. In late May, they were saying that July 17 ranges from $2,700 to $3,200 a car, and in September between $2,800 and $3,000 a car. That's on top of the basis gone in the tank. So although farmers and shippers are incurring higher transportation costs, particularly on the BN, service has deteriorated. Now, my last chart on there that I want to talk about is simply looking at an indexing of rail rates. And what you see is in the fourth quarter, and this comes off the STB site, fourth quarter of 2013 and the first quarter of 2014, the rail rates have skyrocketed. What happens is, if you end up with poor service, means tighter capacity, it means higher prices. Burlington Northern is set in January to increase all of the northern tier rates again. And meanwhile, the basis is in the tank. I want to talk real quick about the pea and lentil growers. They've been hard hit. They ship in less than shuttle quantities, and we've had reports from them that their back orders are up to 120 days behind. Those don't show up on these ones that you're doing. And a couple of them have told us that they've had to recertify their rail car loads for phytosanitary certificates. The phytosanitary certificates only last 30 days. It's taking over 30 days to get the cars to Portland, so they're having to recertify them. The turkey producers in the northern states, and you've heard about that today a little bit, propane is the big issue. I didn't realize that until I started talking to Matt Damon. Matt Damon is the executive director of the turkey producers. I will put his emails in the record for you. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about corn. Mark Starbuck is here, and we tried to work out a system where we could get everybody up, and it just wouldn't work. So what we're going to do is I'm going to submit that statement also for the record for national corn. The key is we're all in this together, but it extends all the way out. You're hearing coal, you're hearing all sorts of commodities. It extends all the way out to the West Coast. The long-term implication, the worst implication, and I was talking with Justin Gilpin the other day in Kansas at the Wheat Commission, what they're most worried about is that we will lose our status as the world resort supplier for grains. And if that goes, they spent years getting that at U.S. Wheat. We're the reliable supplier for all these countries. Yes, it costs a little bit more, but they can always get it from us. That's in jeopardy now. Okay? Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Whiteside. I did notice that Senator Heitkamp did come in, so we'll bring her up here to the front. I met with her a month ago, and I know she has a great interest in these issues.
You bet.
Can we pass that mic down? Thank you.
You don't look like Dan Mogslin. To start with, Mr. Chairman and members of the Surface Transportation Board, I want to applaud you for coming out and holding this local hearing in North Dakota among the producers, among the shippers, and among the people. I think we all remember the times when we felt that the Surface Transportation Board was not responsive. It tended to be a rubber stamp, and I think my experience in the last year working with all of you, raising the alarms, talking about these issues, has been extraordinarily positive. And I think that that is a tribute to what I would say is this metamorphosis of the Surface Transportation Board, looking at all of the relationships and looking at all of the interested parties moving forward. And so my great thanks for you coming to Fargo to address these concerns directly. I know I've been talking certainly to the chairman over the last many months about the concerns of the shippers as expressed to our office, but there is nothing like coming here and seeing a room full of people who are very anxious and rightfully anxious about their economic livelihood. And so I want to start out by first saying we need to at least take a look at the past, because I think sometimes people say, well, this is a new issue. This issue has been ongoing. We had concern about moving the 13 crop almost immediately after the 13 crop had been harvested. There were, along with representations made to the Surface Transportation Board, as well as to the congressional delegation, not just ours, but across the board, about when this issue would clear. And there were assurances given that we would see the bulk, if not the majority, of the 13 crop move before the 14 harvest. I'm not convinced that's true. I'm not convinced that that's the current factual state. And so we need to understand that there's been an extraordinarily high level of patience from the ag producers and shippers, recognizing the challenges on the railroads regarding shipping this new boom that we have, shipping the crude oil out of North Dakota, the increased shipments in the upper Great Plains. And so recognizing that, I think these folks have been extraordinarily patient. But patience is wearing thin as they see the 14 crop coming. So my suggestion is we need a better idea, not this he said, she said that we have, but a better idea of where we are right now. How much crop is waiting to get moved? How many commodities have been delayed? What have been the challenges? And I would really suggest we also need to understand what the monetary consequences of that delay has been for these producers. Now, we talk a lot of numbers, and NDSU did a study, and Minnesota did a study, and I guess we'll find out as those studies work their way through and become completed, preliminarily study at NDSU, but as they become completed, we'll know. But I will tell you that just 2 weeks ago, I was standing with 6 shippers, 6 producers, ag producers, talked from the middle part of my state, and all of them said collectively they believed that those 6 producers, ag producers, had lost over $500,000 because of the failure to ship product on a timely basis. So we have to do something about this in order to balance the common carrier responsibilities of moving all commodities. And so our great hope is coming out of this study that you have today, this hearing that you have today, that we are going to have a better understanding and a better method of collecting data in terms of what the actual delays are. I think if I were sitting in your chair, I'd be extraordinarily frustrated listening to the concerns here and then listening to how we don't think there is that level of backlog. Where is the truth, I think, is the question we need to ask. And the final point that I want to make is that I don't want to be back in this room a year from now. We have the 14 crop coming in, and we will have the 15 crop challenged if we don't figure out how we are going to move this product and these ag products and all of the products that we have. And I applaud, in particular, Burlington Northern for the mammoth amount of investment that they're making. But my concern, once again, is that their plans for investment in the state of North Dakota in 2-3 years will be inadequate to deal with what we need to do to move. We have a projection right now that about from our great ag economists who understand this, that we will see a 14% decline in net income for producers in the 14-year. Think about adding the challenges of shipping the product and marketing the product to that. Think about all of the people here. You'll hear wonderful stories about how they've developed markets in places, after years and years of cultivating those relationships, now have a market only to be a product that can't move to the market when it needs to move to the market, and losing that sale and losing the ability to be the best provider of black beans, the best provider of navy beans. And so I would just once again thank you on behalf of all of the shippers in North Dakota. for your attention to this issue, for your willingness to come here and listen to the concerns. I'd ask that you give me a little extra time to submit written comments. We're still gathering a number of things and would appreciate an opportunity to submit some final written comments within a reasonable period of time so that we can better dialogue all of the issues that I've talked about this afternoon.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Sure.
Senator, I know because of your schedule you weren't able to be here this morning, but I'd be curious to your reaction when we heard from the railroads and specifically from CP about their new system for ordering cars. One of the things that was laid out for us is that they've been working over some period of time with their shippers. In many cases, their shippers were helping them, sort of determine what was the best plan for them, and that, all of the shippers were very well informed about this plan and the time frame for moving into the plan. Now, I know you've sent a letter to the president of CP, Hunter Harrison, raising some questions and concerns, and sort of on behalf of your constituents, I'm wondering if what we heard this morning from CP is consistent with your understanding from your constituents.
I would suggest to you it's not. Obviously, you've probably heard about a meeting that we had in Minot a couple weeks ago where this was a work in progress. What are we going to do? How are we going to work so that we are responsible, so we get the accurate count of what absolutely needs to be delivered in terms of hopper cars, and then when it's going to be picked up and how we're going to monetize that relationship. But there was nothing set in stone, and it's my belief that at the time we had that conversation in that meeting, that was the first time very many of those shippers had heard about that transition. And I think there's a tendency maybe, and without being accusatory, I think there's a tendency to think about the very large shippers that they deal with, which might be about 80%, as they believe, 80% of the crop that they move. And then there's 20%, but that's not the numbers. When they deal with the 80%, they're probably dealing with 2 or 3 major shippers. When they're dealing with the other 20% of the product that needs to move, they're dealing with probably 80% of the number of people that they need to communicate with. And I think the communication tends to be on the large shippers and not to the local shippers or our small grain elevators, not to the single car shippers.
And I'm curious, based upon having had that earlier meeting and knowing there was this discussion about the new car ordering system, were you aware that it was going to go into effect when it went into effect, or were you surprised to learn it had gone into effect?
We anticipated that they'd be making an announcement. What I had hoped is that the announcement would be, this is what we plan to do, please now give us comment. Instead, orders were canceled, causing a great deal of concern. And you'll again hear that from the very many shippers who are present here. And so it seemed to be without a lot of increased discussion. And I hesitate again to be accusatory, and I know that everybody is working through a very, very difficult situation, including Mr. Harrison and Mr. Brooks and obviously Mr. Rose, very concerned about meeting the needs. They want the business. There's no doubt about that. But again, we've got to be able to have a board such as yourself who listens to these concerns, who can help perhaps smooth the way for a better system of balance, a better balance in terms of how we meet the needs of all of our shippers in North Dakota and really across the country.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, guys.
Mr. Cope. We will continue with the Ag panel. Mr. Cope.
Well, thank you, Chairman Elliott, Vice Chairman Miller, Board Member Begeman. Appreciate the opportunity to come before you today. My name is Jerry Cope, and I'm president of the South Dakota Grain and Feed Association, also marketing manager for Dakota Mill and Grain in Rapid City, South Dakota. But my testimony today is primarily on behalf of the South Dakota Grain and Feed Association, who is also an affiliate of the NGFA, the National Grain and Feed Association. As you know, we've talked a lot about agriculture. South Dakota ranks in the top 10 in nearly all crops. So this rail service disruption has impacted our state greatly. We thank you for your efforts to bring this issue to the forefront in past hearings and to hold railroads accountable, restoring service to acceptable levels. Our industry group believes that if we're going to voice concerns, then we also hold a responsibility to stick to the facts and present ideas on how we could get better. So today I'd like to talk about where we were, where we are today, and let you know what we want, expect, and need as we move forward. First of all, I believe my company was typical of others in the state. We began to experience this rail disruption last fall, well before the winter weather, well before any hearings. As the winter rolled through, by spring we were behind over 1,000 cars. And thinking about that number today, the people bandied about how many cars behind. Is that really the important thing, or is the important thing the trend? That we had sales behind every one of those car orders. So we had to try and figure out a way to work through that as the spring and summer approached. We weren't the only ones. We had farmers and other elevators in the state with over twice normal grain inventory as we approached spring planting. We had almost no regular communication with the railroads, and if they had a plan, we sure couldn't identify it. And the BN, secondary freight car costs, were roughly equal to the freight rate. At the peak, somewhere around $5,000 per car was paid for cars. That's about $1.25 a bushel. That effectively doubled the freight rate for corn to the Pacific Northwest. These costs had escalated over time. It wasn't a sudden jump up. And elevators had absorbed many of these costs as they went along, but eventually they had no choice but to reflect them on a lower basis, and that equated probably on average of 50 cents a bushel. My company deals primarily in wheat, and I know wheat cost and lost opportunity of selling for an immediate flour mill demand versus selling for 2 months down the road was in the range of 75 cents to $1.50 a bushel. Ironically, the secondary freight car market rewarded carriers for poor service. The bigger the delay, the larger the premium for freight. Now, railroads will argue that day-to-day secondary freight market premiums don't go to them, but to the owner of the freight, and they're right, that's true. However, this urgency to secure adequate freight for this fall's harvest has resulted in BNSF shuttles for selling for up to $2.5 to $3 million premium in shuttle auctions. To date, the BN has collected over $120 million in these premiums, and that's money that did go to the railroad. Through this crisis, there was little or no communication from the railroads, not a credible plan, and simply put, we in South Dakota felt we were without a voice. Now, in the aftermath of the board's involvement and advocacy, as well as the combined efforts of Senator Thune, our state and national organizations, we are being heard. As a result of this additional communication between the railroads and us, their customers, there is some easing of the fears that we had on if they have a plan for both short and long term. The answers aren't always what we want, but it's a first step. We've made progress cutting the backlog of cars in our region. And this is great news, but it's still very serious. If you need a train every 5 days and get one every 10 to get ready for the fall harvest, you've got a problem. In regard to the CP's performance reports, until recently, it had not provided the locomotives it had committed to, which left the RCP&E unable to clear their lines of loaded cars. This resulted in loaded cars sitting in RCP&E elevators for a week or longer, and we saw a very direct result in buyers shying away from buying RCP&E origin cars until they had proof that the ones they already had bought were actually going to move. The interchange at Tracy, Minnesota still concerns the shippers in South Dakota. Scheduling is critical because there is no actual yard to aid car flow, so if that meet is not perfect, things lag. Talking to South Dakota shippers on the line just this week, we all agree that things are better. But 1 week is not enough to restore confidence after what we've been through. Without the CP honoring all of its commitments on an ongoing and even-handed basis, the problems will only again get worse in South Dakota. That's because South Dakota crop production is expected to be record high this year. Even though our wheat acres were down from the 5-year average, we're seeing yields running double the normal, so our total production is still going to be 10 to 20% above our 5-year average. And the corn production, USDA projects it relatively flat with last year, but if you talk to other private forecasters, they think we could set a record in corn production. And then the other crops look just as good, such as soybeans, sorghums, sunflowers, oats, and millet. Given these projections and the BNSF's and CP's current pace of service recovery, this backlog will continue through this crop year and probably into fall of 14-15. You know, that will depend somewhat on weather, but I think it's logical to assume it's with us until at least next June. So there's no room for even a minor hiccup in rail service this fall and winter. Doesn't matter if it's weather, doesn't matter if it's Chicago, doesn't matter if it's demand from coal or oil. There just isn't any room for any slips. So if there is no change of pace of rail service, the storage of this abundant crop is going to create challenges. In my travels through western South Dakota, I've seen farmer piles ranging from 20 to over 200,000 bushels. Elevators have open ground piles waiting to be shipped. And another thing that hasn't been talked about today is we do have some quality problems in this year's wheat. But with elevators sitting full and unable to blend or clean that wheat, there is some real risk that there's some wheat out there that won't even become marketable because the elevators, if they don't have the room to work with it, then they're just stuck, and that translates back to farmers just losing not cents per bushel, but dollars per bushel. Secondary freight costs have relaxed, but the bids that elevators are offering probably more closely reflect actual freight costs. It looks like there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 30 cents per bushel put in for nearby freight and 40 to 50 for harvest. Now the CP Railroad and the RCP&E and the processing industry do not participate in the secondary market, but they are part of that larger market because pricing for all buyers is inversely proportional to freight availability. The higher the extra cost of rail freight, the less there is to go around, and this impacts the elevator's ability to handle grain. So then we have to ask the question, is it an option for companies to expand storage to accommodate this? Well, over the past 15 years, hundreds of millions of dollars have been invested in South Dakota grain and fertilizer facilities based on expectations of reasonable and predictable rail service. Investments at rail facilities today can run from over $3 million for a minimal amount of bins and a 25-car track upgrade to over $30 million for a state-of-the-art shuttle shipper and fertilizer receiver. So as an industry, we have to ask ourselves, when does the risk outweigh the reward given the unpredictability of transportation services? Now moving forward, we encourage the board to continue your stringent oversight of the ag rail service crisis as the recovery and service continues and ultimately returns to more normal levels. Hopefully, in the long term, your contingent vigilance and a spotlight on this crucial issue will bring about needed communication between the railroads and their shippers that will come into play when railroads are making investment decisions. Now, the BNSF, to their credit, has responded to this heightened awareness with locomotives, crews, and double track. We hope that the CP will follow through with their basic commitments also, so especially to the RCP&E. It is disconcerting, though, that it took your spotlight to get them to actually live up to something they had already agreed to do in the terms of the sale. Ease of doing business and safeguards against overregulation are also important. There are things that can be done that the NGFA is working on that would make it so the railroads can still invest in their systems and grain elevators can still efficiently handle grain. I'll end with saying that we have a saying in our company that the problem with communication is the illusion that it actually took place. This might sound tongue-in-cheek, but it speaks to a real problem. Communication has to be open, honest, and real. Action plans, reports, scorecards from railroads are a real-time basis and needed. Now, in our written testimony, we've got further thoughts on things that the railroads can do and that STB can do and we can do together to make real progress addressing these backlogs. In summary, I'd like to thank you, and let me stress, we're not asking for direct government intervention. We're not asking for preferential treatment for grain. We just want to ensure that we're not disadvantaged or the grain is marginalized in a rail freight picture. Thank you for your time today, entertaining input from us in South Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Cope. Mr. Zelenka?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, my name is Bob Zelenka. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Grain and Feed Association. We represent the grain elevator and feed mill industry in Minnesota. We have nearly 300 cooperative and independent grain elevators and feed mills. In Minnesota, there are approximately 150 grain elevators served by rail. Of that, 50 of those locations are what you'd call maximum capacity unit train loading facilities. We have a storage capacity in Minnesota of about 670 million bushels commercial and over 2 billion bushels on farm. Roughly 75% of the total available storage in Minnesota is located on the farm. Problem we have right now is we do have some situations where producers do want to clear out their farm storage to obviously store their grain in their own bins versus having to store it at the elevator at 3-4 cents a bushel per month option. So there's some areas where there are some grains backing up onto the farm. I certainly want to thank you for your role in providing and asking for service metrics over the last month or two. It's been very helpful to be more transparent about what the railroads are doing. This problem that we ran into, essentially for us, started in September, October with the propane issue. We had propane shortage in Minnesota, upper Midwest, but Minnesota had an acute shortage of propane. A lot of it had to do with the high moisture corn crop, followed by an early winter for heating. This wasn't totally a rail issue, but it was the first time we started to see the congestion issue on the rail. There are some terminals that were served by rail, others served by pipeline. It was a problem with the turkey barns as well in terms of heating, so the list goes on. Suffice to say that we did get through it. We've had some meetings and some summits, if you will, to try to address the issue. One concern we have is that there was a pipeline servicing the Benson area in Minnesota. It's in western Minnesota. That has been now reversed. The pipeline is moving north, some other product, and that now is being expanded to be served by rail. When you look at service metrics, I'm wondering if the STB would consider propane as well as service metrics related to propane in terms of the movement of propane. It is more and more of an issue moving that product, less by pipeline, more by rail. At least in Minnesota this coming fall. A little concerned about that as we approach this fall. Losses were talked about. The commissioner talked about the losses in Minnesota by producers on the study that he referenced. It came out to $18.8 million for soybean growers, $72 million for corn growers, and another $8.5 million in farmer losses in spring wheat. And in terms of elevators, certainly it's been nice to see that the BNSF particularly has been catching up with the past dues. CP is doing what they can. But in the end, we've lost millions of dollars at the country elevator level. A lot of that is was related to contracts that we had where we get discounted when we can't deliver on time, and that can add up quite quickly. We had that issue. We had high interest on money that we borrowed to buy farmer grain that we had to sit on because we couldn't move the grain. We had ground piles that we were dealing with and the quality issues that go with that in terms of loss of quality and a number of other issues. In terms of before I finish up on the propane, I wanted to mention that we had a couple members that wanted to build a propane unload facility on the CP. They were willing to spend the money on the infrastructure, but when it came to the insurance requirement by the CP, it went up from a $25 million general liability policy to they required a $100 million general liability policy, which would have been about $80,000 to $90,000 estimated premium, annual premium. So both these elevators decided that this wasn't worth the investment. You spend that kind of money, whether you're unloading one car of propane or 40 cars of propane. So that, I forgot to mention that when I was talking about propane. The congestion has certainly been an issue for us, and dealing with this issue, I don't want to be redundant, so I'm trying to jump around my comments, but we certainly do appreciate what the BNSF did in developing a strategic plan, addressing the past dues, and that strategy did seem to pay off. Canadian Pacific, on the other hand, has been less than forthcoming. compared to the BNSF in service metrics, and their shippers on the CP continue to be very frustrated. Lack of transparency and this uncertainty that exists. They seem to be on the right track late this last winter, and all of a sudden grain shippers found themselves waiting for timely service again. CP blamed the setback on congestion problems moving freight through Chicago, as you heard. The problem with that excuse is that at the time, most of the grain freight was moving to the Pacific Northwest, not going through Chicago. A more likely culprit was the Canadian government's intervention, which apparently forced the CP to reallocate locomotives and grain hopper cars to the Canadian side of the business, again at the expense of CP grain shippers in Minnesota and North Dakota. Grain shippers on the CP continue to be dissatisfied with the level of communication. CP has shippers, for example, calling an unmanned service desk to try to locate trains. Earlier this year, the CP raised their rates to help pay for a new communication system for grain shippers between Portal, North Dakota and Glenwood, Minnesota, but apparently the system is yet to be installed. CP has unveiled this new service program, as was mentioned, with little or no detail of the actual service contracts, and that didn't come out until last week. In order to sign up for the new contract, again, as I understand it, grain shippers were asked to cancel their old orders, which would make them look like they were caught up. The new program also contains some hidden surprises. Effective September 1, the CP canceled the OEP program, which offered a financial incentive to load a train in a timely fashion, up to $150 per car if loaded within 10 hours. Apparently, the CP was thinking, why provide this financial incentive when they're not picking up these cars in a timely fashion as well? Now, whatever the reasoning was, the unfortunate part is that grain elevators spent thousands, if not many thousands of dollars upgrading their facilities for higher speed legs and storage and so on to help to meet and take advantage of those savings that are no longer there. And that's something you'll never recover. Since early 2013, we've debated this issue obviously quite a bit. And as a result of the hearing, we'd like to see, again, STB to continue requiring the BNSF and CP to provide greater transparency through these service metrics. In addition, we'd like to urge the STB to consider investigating unreasonable rate practices on its own initiative. We'd like to require rail carriers to publish reasonable service expectations for customers. Consider establishing a binding arbitration system to resolve rail rate issues, rail practice, maybe even common carrier service complaints. I'd like also to the STB to address the so-called paper barriers that Class 1 rail carriers can use to restrict or preclude the ability of a tenant or purchaser railroad to interchange traffic with railroads other than the seller or landlord carrier, which I think has been done to a degree. And lastly, and I guess also the commissioners in providing status reports to the STB proceeding. These steps would allow a more balanced environment and would encourage railroad shipper dialogue to resolve business issues directly, thereby enhancing efficient transport of agricultural commodities. Again, I think as Jerry mentioned, we're not looking to receive preferential treatment, but we don't want to be disadvantaged either. We have had, again, a lot of elevators that have went through a lot of pain this winter. Certainly don't want to repeat that, although chances are, and it looks like with the congestion that's on the system yet, we're going to have, hopefully not a repeat of last year, but certainly going to have and run into a lot of traffic delays on the system. With that, I guess I would just encourage your Grain Car Council meeting next week, which is on Thursday in Minneapolis, to maybe take a look at the rail freight issue. That's obviously been a big issue for us, is the cost of freight and thus the relationship to what we can pay our producers, as well as they maybe take a look at the secondary market, how that works, how it functions. Certainly is having an impact on our bottom line. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, STB Ward, and thank you to Chairman Elliott and Vice Chairman Miller and Commissioner Bigeman. First correction would be, my name's not Dan Wogslin. Brad Tickerson. I am immediate past president of North Dakota Grain Growers Association. We're a grower group that represent 15,000 wheat growers and 4,000 barley growers in North Dakota. I'm kind of the root of this whole problem because I'm a North Dakota ag producer. And I'm a third generation farmer. I have 2 boys that are currently farming with me, and I have a 2-year-old grandson that only knows how to play with tractors. So I'm hoping to keep the sustainability of my farm proceeding into the future. We're experiencing right now a downturn in future market, and we're also experiencing a logistics problem in getting rid of this crop. The problem when I say I'm the root of the problem is I'm at the bottom of the totem pole. You've been visiting with shippers, you've been visiting with merchandisers all morning long, but I'm the one that's producing that crop that needs to get through this pipeline. And what has happened in the recent years is that genetics, and due to the ambition of just economics as far as our new, our ability to get site-specific through variable rate seeding and fertilizing, we're able to push these yields to things that we've never seen before. I know my farm is experiencing record spring wheat yields. I think if this corn crop makes it, we're going to have record spring wheat crop also. In order to get this product processed through that normal channels, it won't sit on the farm and just rot in its bins, because our commodities are perishable, and we need that timeliness in order to get that crop delivered into the marketplace. I know we're in depressed prices, and I don't have the luxury of being able to carry many, many years of crop on the storage in order to, wait for a better time. I think what we're experiencing now is the fact that oil has become our big competitor, and that we're having to fight with this, competition for our rail service. If we didn't have oil, we'd still probably be dealing with the infrastructure of just the massive amount of bushels that are being produced by the producers in North Dakota and in the upper Midwest. I would say that it isn't just the bushels that were, I think Robert alluded to the propane issues. Last year we experienced, we actually had to shut down corn harvest during our harvest schedule because the supplier was short of propane. These are other things that we need to have an eye looking at, the input costs that producers have to absorb and take. And we are at the bottom of the totem pole, so we have to stomach it on the output, and we have to stomach it on the input as far as the price goes. I would say that your role as a transportation board would be to make sure that we recognize that this forecast of things aren't going to go away, that we need to have policy in place in order to deliver these products on time, or deliver the cars on time, and that farmers can be timely in getting their products to market, and also being able to be viable as far as their cash flow situations go. I don't want to take a whole lot of time. I think what we're here for today is that we want to become the squeaky wheel, and we want to keep, making sure that this issue is brought, forefront. We understand that policy takes time to change, and that dynamics takes time to change. But we have to recognize that agriculture is a very competitive thing, and if it's also, American agriculture is the envy of the world. And we need to work together as farmers, shippers, and government in order to find solutions that we face. North Dakota grain growers would like to thank you for the opportunity that you came to Fargo, and that we hope that we can enlighten you to some of the situations we have in the upper Midwest. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the entire board for coming to Fargo and holding this hearing. I'm Stu Letcher. I'm the Executive Vice President of the North Dakota Grain Dealers Association, and we're a 103-year-old voluntary membership organization that represents 90% of the grain elevators in the state of North Dakota. This isn't the first time that we've experienced rail delays in the state. And one of the things we've done as an industry is we've invested significant investments in our facilities to increase our storage capabilities and our rail car handling and loading efficiencies. The average capacity of North Dakota grain elevators has increased in the last decade by almost doubling. In 2003 and 4, the average capacity of a North Dakota grain elevator was 600,000 bushels. Today, that's over 1 million bushels. Our elevator network also includes 65 shuttle train loading facilities in which our members have invested hundreds of millions of dollars. You've heard a lot of testimony today about anecdotal evidence, what's happening in the industry. So what we did is we decided to try and bring you up-to-date numbers. So last week we did a poll of our members and we did a survey. We sent out about 100 surveys and we received 42 responses. Of those responses, we had 7 BNF shuttle loaders respond. that said they're completely caught up on shipments, but they're 100 cars behind on less than shuttle shipments. We had 16 BNSF non-shuttle shippers respond, and they report being 333 cars behind. We had 14 CP shuttle loaders respond, and they reported being 5,800 cars behind on shuttle shipments and 1,430 cars behind on less than shuttle shipments. We had 6 CP non-shuttle shippers respond, and they report being 1,260 cars behind. I'd like to share a few of the comments that were in some of these surveys. I think it's better for you guys to hear from the people out in the country on the front lines than to hear from me. One less than shuttle shipper on the CP whose reports being 150 cars behind, his comment was, frustrated with CP power on BN pulling oil, ignoring small to average shippers. Now CP is asking us to trim orders, saying our demand is overstated when we've had to truck out grain. Another reported, CP has asked us to cancel all our existing orders and enter new orders as needed after 9 a.m. on 8/29/14. I'm confused as to why we need to do this. We have also had quality issues, and we have had corn in our facility, as well as farmers with contracts that have been stored so long that now we've had to dump 25 cars and reload to make grade as they became musty. I had planned to have my shipping done by May. On the shuttle side, we've heard from a couple shuttle loaders. One shuttle loader on the CP reports being $1.5 million behind in shipping. And he says, keep in mind, we are coming off a 50% preventive plant year. The CP continues to ask if all our orders are real. The answer is yes. We do not have a freight order on our books that we do not intend to ship against. There is no secondary market. There is no reason to carry more orders than we need. Another CP shuttle loader reported being 1,900 cars behind. He said, we canceled 1,900 orders on August 20th in order to sign up for the CP's DT program that is supposed to start on September 1st. We have 7 locations that load rail cars, 2 are shuttle loaders. Harvest is in full swing, and all of our elevators are full. So that's what we're hearing from the field. There's a couple other things this survey also shows. It also shows that the less than shuttle shipper is experiencing the greatest amount of delays in service. North Dakota produces over 30 different commodities, and only a handful of those are marketed via shuttle train. The smaller unit train and single car shipments are vital to many shippers in the state. One non-shuttle shipper on the BNSF also reported being 135 singles behind, which is 2 months' worth of orders. And you have heard, I think you have a letter up there from another one of our shippers that reports being 21, 25 unit car trains behind. So where do we go from here? We are encouraged by the BNSF's pledge for infrastructure improvements, and we applaud their efforts to address the backlog. But infrastructure improvements take time to complete, and there are still concerns related to their ability to keep current once the bulk of harvest arrives when we move into the colder winter season. The Canadian Pacific has introduced a new rail car program, and we applaud any efforts that they make to improve the efficiency of their system. But those canceled orders represent a large amount of grain volume that is yet to move. CP's new ordering system may help manage the shuttle fleet, but it does little to help the non-shuttle shipper on the CP system who's basically had to cancel all their old orders and start the ordering process over. We would like the STB to continue the metric reporting. Grain shippers watch increased movement of oil on rail and wonder if a major reason for the grain backlog isn't additional rail resources dedicated to oil. Grain shippers report rail yards being clogged with oil trains, and shippers are rightfully upset about their investments in their products sitting idle while new business seems to take priority. As I stated earlier, the grain industry in North Dakota has made major investments in infrastructure to become more efficient rail handlers. We feel it is time for rail carriers to deliver on the promise of better service. Thank you for this opportunity to present our views and suggestions on the matter.
Thank you. On behalf of Minnesota Farms Union, I'd like to thank you guys for your attendance and If I sound nervous, it's because I almost froze to death in here earlier and I'm still recovering. So, I'm actually with Farmers Union. We're going to be flying to Washington this weekend, and I think we're going to meet with the Surface Transportation Board on Monday or Tuesday. So I'm going to speak today as a farmer and an advocate for rural Minnesota, because we need a voice too. I'm a fourth-generation farmer. I got a 7-month-old son who doesn't play with tractors yet, but he looks like he's going to be interested. I want to talk, we talk $500 million, $600 million, a lot of money is being thrown around here today. I want to put a little smaller number, a smaller face to the issue a little bit more, and talk about on farms the direct and indirect impacts that we deal with every day. It's on our mind all the time. And the first direct impact is the basis loss that we incur. Yesterday, December corn closed at $3.52, and historically, a good basis in our area might be, a good one would be 20, and 50 would maybe be average. Well, this morning in Mahnomen, Minnesota, it was 90 cents. In Ulen, it was 94 cents, and those are both unit train facilities meant to handle at the greatest efficiency. So, taking a farm that raises 500 acres of corn, that's easily $40,000 to $50,000 of direct basis loss to that one farm. And I assume that that's a lot of money, right? I mean, anyone can say that's real money, and that's direct loss. That's just on corn, it goes on and on with everything else. So that's the easy direct problems. The indirect thing, or what people don't consider sometimes, we're working with a perishable product. It has to get sold at some point, so we're dealing in a day and age where, green is good. People talk about that a lot, and we're ending up storing this grain a lot longer. We're moving it more. What ends up having to happen is we're using extra aeration, extra electricity, and putting more power or more stress on the power grid just in not being able to move anything. And not being able to move any grain is also adds the cost of accrued interest on our farms. Our credit lines are way bigger than they ever have been, and they're running at a large number, a lot longer, because guys are not able to move grain, or not just know where to go with stuff, or the poor pricing options. 50 cents a difference might make the difference in a sale. It makes a big difference in a sale, actually. And us building more storage on the farm isn't really a great answer either, because that means we just borrow more money and accrue more interest and more overhead. Those are real issues for us. And when it comes to these full capacity elevators, I have a friend out, and he farms in the Bakken area out in North Dakota, and his bins are full right now, and he's got his wheat sitting out there. It's wet. Can't combine until it's dry, because they don't dry the corn, or don't dry wheat out there, I guess. But when you do bring it in, it's cash only if they can take a load, which they generally can't. But if they do, it's cash only. And you dump it, it's sold. But you don't know what your discounts are, because they're going to get shipped off, and they're going to be checking for vomitoxin and falling numbers and all that. So it's sold, and you don't even know what the price you got. That's a pretty big deal too. And maybe one of the bigger, for the whole broad rural Minnesota, farmers spend all their money locally. I mean, within 50 miles of home, that's where your money gets spent. So it does have an effect on Main Street business ownership, and on down the line. Farmers' money really does stay local. It's not going to an overseas account. It stays in the hometown. So, and I don't know what the truth is, but the perception to the farmers out in western North Dakota is they want to know, of these late cars, how many of them are ever an oil car, or are they all just grain cars? And if it's all grain cars, it seems like the farmers and small businesses are basically subsidizing big oil on, on our dime. So with that, I want to thank you guys again, and we'll probably see you next week.
Great. Thank you very much to this panel for their presentations. Just quickly, a couple questions. With respect to CP's new program, I mean, we've heard various sides to that program. I mean, how are you, the ag shippers, viewing that as a community? Are you viewing it as something that could be helpful down the road, or are you viewing it as something that is maybe would hinder you as you go forward, especially as a smaller shipper?
I'll be the first to tackle that. From my membership, they're very positive on the new program. They're happy that they're going to a system that will help them manage the fleet better, if that's what it does. The concerns we've been hearing is that let's not forget about the crop that was there against the old orders that were canceled. There's still a lot of crop that needs to move. So if that new system does improve efficiency, great. But there again, the single car shipper, it's not going to solve their problem. It's a shuttle train program. So if you're a single car shipper, you're still going to be struggling with the same issues.
Okay, great. Are you hearing, and maybe your response answers this question, but are you hearing anything with respect to cancellations that we've heard about that are unilateral from the railroad side as opposed to the shipper side? Or do you view that as a bilateral decision between the railroad and the shipper themselves? Are you hearing anything either way?
Well, it seems like it's bilateral. I mean, there is, yes, it's initiated by the shipper, but I don't think there's an option really to not do that. In order to get a new system and participate in the new system, you have to cancel your old orders. I think there's a lot of uncertainty, as Stu was talking about, a lot of uncertainty, particularly by the less than shuttle or less than unit train loaders, or shippers, that is, whether they should cancel and try through the new system. But again, it's only been a week, and so there's still a lot of uncertainty as to whether this will in fact work. You can be hopeful that it is and will, but again, communication has been less than ideal between the shippers and the CP. Hopefully that will improve, but yeah, that's been I think it's just part of the deal that I think elevators have to abide by.
And have you heard any? I get a lot of anecdotal stories, so I'm kind of trying to eliminate some of them from the way I think of this issue. So have you had any issues with respect to, especially the smaller shippers, the single cars, with respect to any of the carriers refusing to move a car in a certain direction or a certain place? Or have the railroads been pretty much, we'll take your order, maybe it's not going to be on time, apparently, obviously, but we will take your order and move it wherever you would like it to go. Has that posed any issues for anybody as far as being able to move a car to a certain place at a certain?
Well, I think there was a time when the CP wouldn't take any orders going through Chicago just because of the congestion problem there. But Jerry, yeah.
What I hear more of is not so much that they won't take it someplace, they don't bring them in the first place. I mean, if the less than shuttle loaders can't get the cars, it really doesn't matter. But I think that's what we're hearing is that a number of them have cars that are outstanding for long periods. So you heard someone this morning talk about April, just filling April orders now. We're seeing 120-day behind. And remember, this is a very important part of the system. Now, this is not, we're not trying to beat up on anybody. I think the Burlington Northern's trying very hard. But the real reality is, as they realign the fleet to more shuttles, they have less than shuttles. And that's of concern to a lot of producers out in Washington and northern Idaho and Montana especially, because that's where all their rotational crops and peas and lentils and pulse crops go. They aren't marketed through the shuttles. I think they were saying that, someone was saying that on the panel here. So it's a matter of not that they won't, they just aren't delivering the cars with consistency.
Okay. Vice Chairman?
I have one.
Oh,
I'm
Mr. Chairman,
sorry.
I did have one comment on your last question. And I know we're not, here to talk about rates, but I think this fits in context of cars not coming because of the destination. Does that happen or doesn't? We've heard that expression from all the railroads we deal with, that, Chicago's a bottleneck, Chicago's a bottleneck. But then we've asked the question back, not just our own company, but others in the state, well, if that's true, then there are destinations short of Chicago, particularly in wheat, that could easily be accessed, but the rates to those destinations are actually higher than Chicago, even though they're closer. So our pushback has been, if you're serious about avoiding Chicago, then do something to incent us to go somewhere other than Chicago. So far, no good. I mean, I'd like to say so far so good, but it hasn't happened.
Yeah, that's something we were talking about last night, is they aren't incentivizing to go anywhere else. And two things that I wanted to close with. One, you've heard mention about oil metrics. It would be really helpful, I think, for the farm community if you would require the Burlington Northern and the CP to give us oil metrics on back-ordered cars on oil, and how, where are they? Because we don't have any idea where some of these back orders go or come from. The other one was on propane. You heard that earlier today, and I think that one's a good one. Years ago, we had 7 years of drought in Montana. And there was a farm producer that said to me, I know one thing for sure about the drought. And I said, what's that? And he says, eventually it'll get back to normal. And he was right. In this particular case, eventually this will get back to normal, but not without your help. And I commend you for that, because if it wasn't for what's going on right now, I don't know where we would be, but I don't think we would be as far down the road to solving the problem or getting through it. We're looking at 2015, 2016 at least, before these things will get back to normal. That's hundreds of millions of dollars later. But I commend you for coming here and listening.
First of all, thank the entire panel for your information, and certainly I, as a daughter of a farmer, I know that you guys do not have many well-slept nights, and I mean, it's a tough job every single day. Thank you for the effort that you went to canvass your elevators to give a sense of what is the demand out there. I've been sitting here, I really, one of the things I would like to try to accomplish here collectively, perhaps, is the way to do it, is to help CP find out what its back order is. I think we're all willing to accept that it's not 22,000. Let's help them get to what that real number is. I don't know if from what you were able to put together, and I was trying to write frantically and I didn't get past 5,800, but did you have the tally? And I also wonder if you could find out from the folks that did respond, could you provide that to CP? I've learned mostly through Mr. Whiteside over the years, but frankly, so many meetings I have, and our staff also reminds me more than I'd like to hear, that people are worried about retaliation, and so they'll share their frustrations, but we're kind of hand-tied and can't necessarily do anything about it with specificity.
that was one of the things that we put into our surveys. You know, we asked a question whether we could use their name or not, and some allowed us to, and some said, you can use my information, but please don't say my name. And so we would be happy to share that information. As a matter of fact, that was one of the things we put out in the survey was that, hey, we were going to share this with railroads and anybody else who's interested.
And if anyone else has, and I know you didn't, not everyone responded to you, but if there is another, I mean, if we just start calling all of your elevators, I'll start doing that if I need. I think we all would. We just need, and I know that that isn't the only thing that matters, because the point is they need to get served, which is a point I was trying to make with when I mentioned the letter. It's like, well, that was clearly not a phantom order, and it was languishing since April. So how can we facilitate service? But I welcome your ideas on how we can best get to the bottom line on this. The issue of propane, which I appreciate you bringing up, it's something that I met with the Minnesota Regional Railroad Association in July, and it was an issue that we were talking about. And you know, I certainly know that the pipeline has shut down, and that is going to put a much bigger stress on your ability to get propane. But as I was talking, I had a gentleman from BN pointed out to me, he's like, we have no orders for propane at this point. And I know you asked for metrics, et cetera, and I also met with some CHS propane folks from Minnesota, and this was about a couple weeks ago, and one of the gentlemen is in the audience, but they have been going around to their customers trying to urge folks to make sure you fill up, order. A carrier can't deliver if it hasn't given a request. So to the extent that you do make sure that you can communicate, you need to get your requests in, because winter is around the corner, and probably wet, based on last night, wet harvest and drying, and just the more that you can, we don't want to create a big rush on propane orders, but the railroads, I mean, you can't beat them up for not delivering something that they didn't have advance notice that you needed. And I just have one more question if I could ask, but when I was at that Minnesota meeting, a gentleman in the audience who was not from Minnesota, he's like, aren't you, there's always a car shortage, and it's always, the farmer against the railroad. I mean, isn't this the same old thing? And, I'd like to hear your response to that. I mean, my impression is that it is not. I mean, when I first went to work on the Hill, one of the first jobs I had was talking to a farmer in Parker, South Dakota, who could not get grain cars. I think that the difference now is that just like the extent, the numbers, whether it's really not 22,000, but the numbers have been significant. And I just like to, some of you guys have been here a little longer than I have, but is this just typical, or is this unprecedented?
I'll speak as far as producer goes. The trouble is we deal with Mother Nature, so the timing of the crop and the size of the crop and the wetness of the crop when it comes to propane is all kind of in her cards. So to order those propane cars or to know when that harvest starts is always that wild card. So to get timeliness, that takes a big amount of communication and somebody with their ear to the pulse as far as when the maturity of that crop is. So I think that's the whole logistics thing here, is that we don't know the demands we need of propane, and we don't know the timing of it and the size of the crop until we actually get out there.
In terms of grain car shortage, I think it's more of a utilization or a proper positioning of the inventory. Perhaps we back in the 90s, we did have car shortages. I don't think we have technically a car shortage anymore. But again, more of its placement. In terms of the propane question you had, right, last year was a small amount of propane that was hauled by the railroads. It's an increasing amount, though, coming up this year, both on the CP and on the BNSF, and that's the concern I have, just with that growing dependence on propane delivery by rail. That concerns us.
For South Dakota, I'd say it's unprecedented, and I would agree with Bob. It's not necessarily a car shortage, it's a utilization, it's a velocity problem, because really the shuttle system was built on velocity. But for South Dakota, normally we would always snap back and catch up in April, roughly, during car shortages because elevators and farmers are onto agronomy and other things. It didn't happen this year, so we had a huge carryover into this year. So it's new territory for us.
I guess I'm one of those people you're referring to that's been around for a long time. It's interesting, after the Burlington Northern Santa Fe mergers and the UPSP mergers, and once they got through the problems with the service metrics there, we did not have any major car shortages for the last probably 10 years. And what's going on now is a service meltdown that really was systemic to too much business too quickly that came onto the system, and that was predominantly oil. But it's so I think the railroads have done a marvelous job over the years. Yes, there's spot shortages every single year. One person out here, somebody in Kansas doesn't have it. I mean, that's normal, but not like this. Now remember, we're not seeing these kind of issues on the UP right now. So this is really a northern tier problem. And I think the railroads have done a marvelous job over the years of actually providing car supply sufficient enough to get us through the harvest. Harvest is always tough because it peaks and it comes to the system very quickly. I'm very concerned about the long-term implications into the Pacific Northwest with oil moving over there and potential of export coal at some point, although that's getting a little cloudy. But the key is all of those tell me that this solution is a long way off for solving some of these issues. So this is why we need the board engaged, and I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming.